Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I was 34 years old, living in New York City, working the night shift at Butte Hospital's ICU. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. Over time, I'd grown used to the eerie stillness that came with working nights. The way the dim lights cast long shadows down empty hallways, the soft hum of ventilators echoing in rhythm. It often felt like the hospital itself was breathing. Every nurse had heard the stories. Old hospitals collect more than dust and memories. Some say they hold on to things that don't belong. I never believed in all that, at least not until I was assigned to room 509. The patient in 509 was Joseph Holloway, a 43-year-old man who had been in a coma for 3 months after a severe accident. No family, no visitors, just the machines keeping him alive. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but the moment I stepped into his room, something felt wrong. The air was colder, heavier, and the smell. Hospitals always smell sterile, like disinfectant. But here it was different. It smelled like damp earth. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was just tired. I checked Joseph's vitals, adjusted his IV, and was about to leave when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost lost in the steady beeping of the monitors, but I swear I heard it, a soft, broken murmur. My first thought was that someone was behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. I swallowed hard and looked at Joseph. His eyes were closed, his expression was still, but his lips were slightly parted. I leaned in, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, the whisper, coming from his mouth. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the bedside tray. Coma patients don't whisper. Maybe it was an involuntary sound, I told myself. The mind plays tricks, especially during long, quiet shifts. I told myself it was nothing. I had to. But as I reached the door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft chuckle. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That a man in a coma laughed at me? I forced myself to move on. But deep down, I dreaded my next shift. 2 nights later, my schedule came in. I was assigned to room 509 again. My stomach twisted as I stood outside the door. Still, I had a job to do. Everything looked the same. Same machines, same soft beeping, same chill in the air. I checked his vitals, my ears straining for any sound. Silence. Maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe, please, help me. The voice was barely more than a breath, but it came from Joseph. I froze. My mind scrambled for medical explanations, involuntary vocalizations, brain activity spikes, but none of it calmed me. I forced myself to speak. Joseph? My own voice sounded small, fragile. No response. I reached for the call button to alert the doctor, but the moment my hand brushed it, his fingers twitched. Not a small reflexive twitch, a grasp. I jerked my arm back, heart hammering in my chest. His hand relaxed again, motionless. Then, his head turned, just slightly, toward me. Every instinct screamed run, but I couldn't move. His lips moved once more, and this time I heard it clearly. He's coming. My breath caught in my throat. Who was coming? I wanted to believe it was meaningless, just random neurons firing, but deep down I knew better. The room felt different now. The air pressed heavy against my chest. The overhead lights flickered, just enough to make my skin prickle. I looked at the monitor. Joseph's heart rate had spiked. Then the whispering started again, but it wasn't from him. It came from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the vents. Dozens of hushed voices overlapping, whispering words I couldn't understand. The sound made my stomach twist. I backed toward the door and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. The automatic lock was engaged. My ID badge should have opened it, but when I swiped it, the reader flashed error in red. Then Joseph moved again. His eyelids fluttered. I pressed myself against the door, eyes wide as his mouth opened, wider than any human mouth should. The whispering grew louder, more desperate, like something was trying to force its way through him. I grabbed my radio. ICU, room 6. Static. A shrill screech filled my ears. Then my own voice echoed back through the speaker. I need help in ICU room 6 now. The radio cut out. I turned to Joseph. He wasn't alone anymore. A shadowy figure stood beside his bed. Tall, featureless, its form flickering like a bad TV signal. The air turned ice cold. Joseph's lips moved once more. He's here. The lights went out. The emergency backup flickered on, dim, red, and worse than darkness. The shadow stretched across the walls, twisting unnaturally. A single ragged breath sounded behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just my reflection in the glass window. Then it moved. A tall, distorted shape loomed behind me, its fingers reaching forward. I didn't think. I ran. The door suddenly unlocked and I stumbled into the hallway, sprinting toward the nurse's station, heart racing. I looked back once. Joseph was still sitting up, grinning, eyes locked on mine, and the shadow beside him was moving toward the door. I never went back into that room. Joseph died later that night. No medical reason, no warning, just gone. His chart disappeared from the system. No one ever mentioned him again. But sometimes, during the quiet hours of the night shift, when the ICU is still, I still hear whispering. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real horror stories. I used to work as a night shift nurse in a Seattle ICU when I was 29 years old. Night shifts were always eerie, but nothing prepared me for what happened in room 407. It started as an ordinary shift, cold coffee, dim corridors, and the distant hum of medical machines. The hospital felt strangely quiet that night, almost too quiet, as if something was holding its breath. The feeling crept up on me, but I brushed it off. I had real work to do. I was assigned to Mr. Harold Grayson, a 78-year-old man who had suffered a severe stroke. He was frail, unconscious, and connected to more tubes than I could count. The doctors said his chances were slim, but we still did everything we could to keep him stable. His vitals were weak, but he was still alive. At least that's what I thought. At 2:17 a.m., everything changed. As I sat at the nurse's station, the alarm from room 407 suddenly blared. My heart jumped and I rushed inside with my colleague Mark. We checked his vitals. Flatline. No pulse, no breathing. We called it. Harold Grayson was dead. We followed protocol, notified the family, and moved his body to the morgue. It was over. Or so we thought. We returned to our rounds, shaken but professional. Death wasn't unusual in the ICU, but something about Harold's death felt wrong. Maybe it was the way his eyes had been slightly open, staring blankly. Or maybe it was the overwhelming chill in the room, right before the monitors went silent. I couldn't shake the unease. An hour later, as I walked past room 407, my breath caught in my throat. The door was slightly open. The room had been emptied after Harold's body was taken away. But as I peered inside, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The heart monitor was beeping. I stepped inside cautiously, my pulse pounding. The bed was empty, but the machine showed a weak, irregular heartbeat. The screen flickered, glitching between flatline and a faint pulse. I backed away, feeling a wave of nausea. This wasn't possible. Harold was dead. I called Mark over, trying to sound rational. "Maybe it's just a monitor malfunction," he said, fiddling with the wires. But as soon as he touched it, the screen cut to static. The machine let out a sharp, ear-piercing screech before going silent. We both just stood there, unable to explain what we'd just seen. I turned to leave, but then the bathroom door inside the room creaked open. The light inside was off, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. My stomach twisted. There was no one else assigned to this room. It was supposed to be empty. I whispered, "Hello?" The figure stepped forward. Mark yanked me back just as the overhead lights flickered violently. We bolted out of the room, locking the door behind us. We reported it to security, but when they arrived, the room was just as it should be. Empty, silent, and still. Mark and I didn't speak as we walked back to the nurse's station. Neither of us wanted to admit what we had seen. Maybe it was just exhaustion, a trick of the dim lights. But deep down, we both knew something was wrong. At 4:12 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. A deep, static-filled voice whispered something inaudible. It was coming from room 407, the room that should have been empty. My stomach clenched as I grabbed the phone to page security again, but before I could dial, the intercom whispered my name. It was faint, barely audible, but I knew what I had heard. "Nathan, come back." My breath hitched. No one in the hospital called me Nathan. Everyone used my last name. I hadn't heard my first name on duty in years. Mark heard it too. His face was pale, his hands shaking. That wasn't a malfunction," he muttered. I refused to go back into room 407, but the intercom continued to hiss and whisper, every few seconds forming another static-drenched word. "Help me. Still here. Not done." I slammed the speaker button, cutting it off. But the moment I did, every light in the hallway flickered violently. Security arrived 10 minutes later, but by then everything had returned to normal. The room was silent. The intercom was dead. They searched the entire area, but there was no one inside, no sign of anyone breaking in, nothing to explain what we had heard. I was ready to go home early, but then the morgue called. You guys moved a patient down here earlier, right?" The voice on the line sounded uneasy. "Yeah," I answered hesitantly. "Harold Grayson, room 407. The silence on the other end made my skin crawl. Then finally, the morgue assistant spoke. "We need you to come down here. Right now." I exchanged a nervous glance with Mark before heading to the basement. Deep down, I already knew what was wrong. Inside the morgue, the assistant led us to Harold's body. He was still on the slab, covered in a white sheet. But the problem wasn't a T with his body. It was with the heart monitor attached to him. It was beeping. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. A heartbeat. Weak, irregular, but undeniably there. Harold Grayson was showing signs of life, but that was impossible. He had been dead for over 2 hours. Mark stammered. This has to be a mistake." But then beneath the sheet, I saw his fingers twitch. The room went dead silent except for the faint, irregular beeping of the monitor. Mark and I stood frozen, staring at Harold's twitching hand beneath the sheet. The morgue assistant backed away, muttering, That's not possible." Slowly, I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had seen him die. I had checked his vitals myself. He had been cold, lifeless, and yet, here he was, his fingers curling slightly as if trying to grip something unseen, or someone unseen. Mark whispered, We have to check." His voice was shaking. Neither of us wanted to do it, but we had no choice. I swallowed hard and reached for the edge of the sheet. With trembling fingers, I pulled it down just enough to expose his face, and nearly dropped it in horror. Harold's eyes were open wide, glassy, completely unblinking. His mouth was slightly parted, as if caught mid-breath, but his skin was still pale and cold. There was no true life in him, just that impossible heartbeat on the monitor. Then his lips moved, a whisper. I jerked back so fast I nearly tripped. I couldn't understand what he said, but I knew he was trying to speak. Mark, his face drained of color, leaned in cautiously. "Harold," he whispered. The moment he said the name, the heart monitor flatlined. The room plunged into chaos. The assistant reached for the emergency button, but before he could press it, Harold's mouth stretched open wider than any human should be able to. A sickening gasp echoed through the room, the sound of someone breathing in for the first time. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed Mark and we ran. The doors swung open violently as we stumbled into the hallway, the sound of the flatline screeching behind us. By the time security arrived, the monitor was off. The body was still, lifeless once more. No heartbeat, no movement, just cold, dead silence. Mark and I never spoke about that night again. The hospital quietly erased the records, and Harold Grayson was listed as deceased. Only once. But I can't forget what I saw, or what I heard, because sometimes in the middle of the night when the ICU is quiet, I still hear a whisper, calling my name. I used to work the night shift at a hospital in San Francisco when I was 29. It wasn't my first job in the medical field, but it was by far the most unsettling. The ICU at night had a way of making you feel small, like you were standing on the edge of something you couldn't quite see. The halls were dimly lit, the air always smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the silence was never truly silent. I worked as a patient care technician, assisting nurses with minor tasks. The hospital was old, renovated multiple times, but its bones were still the same. Some of my co-workers joked that certain parts of the ICU hadn't changed since the 1950s. I never paid much attention to that, at least not until the bed in room 409 started moving on its own. Room 409 was located at the end of the West Wing, reserved for critical patients who needed constant monitoring. One night around 2 a.m., I walked past it and noticed something odd. The bed, completely unoccupied, had shifted several inches from where it was supposed to be. I frowned and checked the wheels. They were locked just as they should have been. No one had been in that room since the last patient had passed away a week earlier. I assumed someone must have bumped it earlier and forgotten to move it back. But when I returned an hour later, the bed had moved again. This time it was nearly a foot away from the wall, and the wheels were still locked. I pushed it back into place myself, double-checking everything. The room felt colder than the hallway outside. The next night, I decided to keep an eye on room 409 around the same time. At exactly 2 a.m., I heard a faint scraping sound. When I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. The bed had moved again, now positioned directly in the center of the room. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the area. The monitors were off. The air felt unnaturally heavy, and the silence pressed down on me. I mentioned it to one of the nurses, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she just sighed and said, "Yeah, that room does that sometimes." I blinked, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. She told me that for years, staff had reported finding the bed in strange positions, always in the middle of the night. Some joked that the last patient who died there never really left. I tried to shake it off, but the following nights only made things worse. No matter how many times I pushed the bed back, it would move again. Sometimes just a few inches, sometimes almost across the entire room. One night I decided to record it. I set up my phone facing the bed before my shift ended, hoping to catch whatever was happening. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my blood ran cold. The video showed the bed sitting still for over an hour, until exactly 2:03 a.m. Then, without anyone touching it, it jerked forward a few inches, then again, and again. It wasn't rolling. It was being dragged. I didn't know what to do with that video. If I showed it to my coworkers, they'd either laugh or believe me. And somehow, both options felt terrifying. So I kept it to myself. But that didn't stop the unease from growing every time I walked past room 409. On my next shift, I decided to test it. Early in the night, I checked the room. The bed was in place, pressed against the wall, wheels locked. I even placed a small strip of tape on the floor beside one leg, so I'd know if it moved again. Hours later, around 2 a.m., I forced myself to walk by. My breath hitched. The bed was now in the middle of the room again. The tape was torn. It looked as if something had dragged the bed right through it. The air was freezing, and for the first time I felt something pressing on my chest. A heavy, suffocating presence, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The janitor, an older man named Luis, caught me staring into the room. He shook his head slowly and muttered, "Don't mess with that bed." When I asked what he meant, he just said, "Something in there doesn't like being disturbed." That was all he would tell me. Over the next few nights, other strange things started happening. The monitor in that room would flicker on and off, even when unplugged. The call button above the bed would light up at random, even though no one was assigned there. Security footage aimed at the room always turned to static. It was as if something didn't want to be seen. Then one night I was alone in the hallway when I heard it. A low, scraping noise, slow, deliberate. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I did. The bed was moving, not shifting, moving. It rolled steadily toward the doorway, stopping just before crossing into the hall. My pulse hammered in my ears. Against all reason, I stepped closer. The air felt charged, like standing beside a live wire. I reached out toward the mattress, and the bed lurched forward an inch. That was all it took. I ran. I avoided room 409 for the rest of the week. But on my last night before my days off, curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know if there was an explanation. I asked one of the older nurses, Maria, about the room. Her expression darkened immediately. "That room?" she whispered, glancing down the hall. "There was a patient there years ago. He was in a coma. No family. No visitors. One night his heart stopped. When the nurses tried to resuscitate him, the bed started moving on its own." She paused. "After that night, that room was never the same. Some say he never left." That stuck with me. Later that night, I couldn't resist walking past room 409 one more time. The door was open slightly, creaking as if inviting me in. The bed sat in the center again, but this time the sheets were pressed down, as though someone was lying there. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to take a picture, but before I could, the call button above the bed lit up. A sharp, rhythmic beep echoed through the hall. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The air turned ice cold. Then, as if on cue, the bed jerked violently forward, slamming against the wall with a metallic screech. That was it. I ran. I told my supervisor I refused to take rounds near that room again. I never said why, but I think they already knew. A week later, I heard they finally removed the bed from room 409. No one said why, but I had a feeling they'd experienced something too. Since then, I can't walk past an empty hospital bed without feeling uneasy. And sometimes when I'm alone in the hall late at night, I still hear it, that faint scraping sound of wheels moving slowly across the floor. And no matter where I am in the building, room 409's door is always just slightly open. I was 36 when this happened. I had recently moved to Oklahoma City for a new job as a night shift nurse in the ICU. The work was exhausting, but I didn't mind. Until one particular night changed everything. It was late October, and the hospital halls felt emptier than usual. Something about that night was off. The air was unusually cold, and even though I was used to the eerie stillness of night shifts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first I blamed exhaustion. ICU wards always carried a certain quiet tension, but this was different. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the sterile floors. It started when I was making my rounds. Room 306 had been unoccupied for weeks after the last patient passed away. Yet when I walked past it, I saw something impossible. An outline of a person standing near the bed. My heart stopped. I blinked, turned back, but the room was empty. I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper. My name. It was so soft, almost like a breath, but it crawled down my spine. No one else was around. The nurse's station was far down the hall. Trying to shake it off, I moved on, but the whispers didn't stop. Every time I passed room 306, I heard them. They weren't loud, but persistent, like someone desperately trying to get my attention. By 3 a.m., I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to check the room just to ease my paranoia. Inside, everything was in order. The bed was neatly made, monitors unplugged, but the feeling that someone was there was undeniable. I froze in the doorway, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then the bed moved. Not much, just a small shift, as if someone had pressed down on it. I stepped back, gripping the doorframe. There was no draft, no open windows, nothing that could explain it. I reached for the light switch, and just as I did, the whisper came again, louder this time, right behind me. I spun around, expecting someone to be there, but the hallway was empty. My skin prickled as I quickly shut the door and walked away. I told myself it was exhaustion, long hours, little sleep, but deep down I knew better. Something was in that room, and it knew my name. Around 4 a.m., I sat at the nurse's station, trying to distract myself with paperwork. The others were on break and I was alone. That's when I saw it. The monitor displaying room surveillance flickered. Static washed over the feed, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. I leaned closer. There, at the foot of the bed, stood a pale figure, motionless, facing away from the camera. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my radio, calling for security, but before I could finish my sentence, the figure vanished. Security arrived a few minutes later, but the room was empty. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They called it a camera glitch, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't tell them about the whispers or the heavy air that clung to that room like fog. And when I passed by again, I noticed something else. The bedsheet was slightly disturbed, like someone had just gotten up. By the end of my shift, I was completely drained. As I gathered my things, I heard it again, this time right in my ear, so close I could feel the breath on my skin. A single word. Wait. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Just the quiet hum of machines in the distance. I left the hospital as soon as daylight broke, but something told me whatever was in room 306 wasn't done with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I closed my eyes, and there it was again. That same whisper, soft, distant. Wait. I sat up, heart racing. My room was empty, but I could feel it. That unseen weight, watching. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hospital room, the empty bed, the faint indent in the mattress, the shadow at its foot. I'd wake up gasping, certain I'd heard footsteps or breathing just beyond the dark. The next night, back at work, I avoided room 306 completely. I stayed near the nurse's station, focusing on paperwork. But around 2 a.m., the motion detector for room 306 went off. I stared at the monitor, dread rising in my chest. The screen flickered with static, and then for a brief moment I saw it again. The figure, standing in the same place, facing the bed. Cold sweat dripped down my back as I grabbed my radio, but before I could call security, the screen cleared. The bed was empty. The motion alert stopped. My instincts screamed at me not to go inside, but I had to know. I had to prove to myself that it wasn't real. The hallway to room 306 felt endless. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed earlier. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The room looked normal. Bed made, lights off. But the air was thick, charged, and then I felt it. A cold pressure around my wrist, like fingers wrapping tightly but not solid. I yanked my arm back and stumbled out of the room, gasping for breath. Through the door, I heard it, the soft rustle of sheets, then the sound of footsteps moving closer. I froze. Then the whisper came again, clear and chilling. "Why didn't you help me?" That was enough. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My coworker looked at me, concerned, but I couldn't speak. I just sat there shaking. For the rest of the night, I avoided that hallway. But deep down, I knew whatever was in that room was trying to reach me, and I had no idea why. The next night, I tried not to think about it, but when I walked past room 306, the door was open again, just enough for me to see inside. The bed was no longer empty. The sheets were indented like someone was sitting there, waiting. My throat went dry. I forced myself closer, peering through the gap. The air was freezing, heavy. And then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, desperate. "Help me." My pulse thundered, but some pull made me step inside. Maybe I needed to understand. Maybe I just couldn't take running anymore. The door closed softly behind me, even though I hadn't touched it. "Who are you?" I whispered. Silence. The air grew colder. Then, a soft shuffle across the floor. My skin prickled. The sheets began to shift, slowly, deliberately, forming the shape of someone lying down. Then the heart monitor beside the bed beeped once, then again. A faint, rhythmic sound. That's when it hit me. I rushed to the nurse's station, grabbed the old patient records, and flipped through them with trembling hands. Room 306. Last admitted patient, Daniel Carter. My breath caught. Daniel Carter. The man I seen struggling on my last shift, the one I couldn't reach in time. He hadn't made it to the ambulance. He'd died in that bed. And now, he was still there. My chest tightened with guilt. I walked back into room 306, heart pounding. The air felt different now, sad, almost pleading. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't know." The air shifted again, lighter, almost peaceful. The indentation on the bed slowly smoothed out as if someone had finally let go. And then, one last whisper, soft and faint. "Thank you." I left the hospital a few days later, unable to work another shift there. But even now, sometimes when the night is quiet and the air feels colder than it should, I still hear it. That same voice, that same whisper. "Wait."